what kind of age of harmony and peace is this if you want eugenics to be your governing science of population control?
Hello and welcome back to another MindMatters show, everybody. And today we're very happy to have back with us Matthew Ehret. Matthew is a major contributor to two sites, the CanadianPatriot.org and the RisingTideFoundation.net. And we've had Matthew on several months ago for a wonderful interview, and we're so happy to have him back. Matthew, welcome.
Oh, it's always great to be back with you guys.
Excellent. Well, you recently put out an article that is called How the Unthinkable Became Thinkable. Eric Lander, Julian Huxley, and the Awakening of Sleeping Monsters. And you also have two other articles that are waiting in the wings that we've had a chance to read for the most part. The first or the second in this series is called Eugenics, the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Clash of Two Systems, as well as From Russell and Hilbert to Wiener and Harari, The Disturbing Origins of Cybernetics and Transhumanism. And we've had a chance to read these, Matthew, and I think what's so special about them is that they present a philosophical underpinning for all of the kind of Fourth Industrial Revolution, Great Reset, One World Order, new technocracy developments that we're seeing on the world stage that we don't quite often get in most other pieces that we read. And so maybe just starting with the first of the three, if you can give us a little bit about because you mentioned UNESCO and the World Health Organization and a lot of these major organizations that have this kind of massive impact on public policy. Mm-hmm. But they're underpinned by these philosophies that go back decades long that inform what it is that they're trying to do now, which is quite interesting. So I wonder if you can give us a couple of key points about what is informing these organizations and how they're being used to implement these wide-scale policies that we're seeing now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess the thing that got me on this particular path was that I had Victory Day had just passed. The 76th anniversary of Victory Day at the end of World War II had just passed, and I'd authored an article on isn't it about time to think about finally winning World War II 76 years later? The point that I try to get at polemically is that, yes, although we're told, rightfully so, that the fascist machine was put down in 1945, and the Allies won and yada yada, a big part of that tale was not finalized, and that deals with what did not happen at Nuremberg. And when you start digging a little bit deeper than the surface appearance of things, a lot of the causes of World War II, by that I'm referring to the major financial institutions in the city of London, in Wall Street, the same financiers who had put Mussolini on Time magazine's cover 8 times, before World War II even started, as the miracle solution, the economic miracle solution to all of our woes. These forces, and this includes also people like, Prescott Bush, the entire nexus of Brown Brothers Harriman, the Union Banking Corporation, the Rockefeller Foundation, all of these groups were never punished in Nuremberg. And in fact, when you get around to looking at what happened during the Cold War, these are the same organizations that reorganized themselves and ended up shaping much of the past 75 years of world history, to the point that this is what are the dominant forces even today. So one of the things about Hitler specifically that was so destructive, I think, was the rise and implementation, the full hog implementation of eugenics as a new scientific religion It really was. And Francis Galton, the cousin of Darwin, who developed eugenics, made the point that it must become the new scientific religion to replace all obsolete religions that are not compatible with the scientific management of society. So this had already been done in the United States, in Canada. 33 states in the U.S. by 1945 had already passed eugenics laws. Two provinces, Alberta and British Columbia in Canada, had done the same. Tens of thousands of people were sterilized based upon statistical science of, like your parents and your grandparents and great grandparents had a predisposition to a low IQ or criminal behavior, and thus just by taking linear extrapolations into your gene pool's future, they were able to then justify scientifically, well, I'm sorry, you have to be sterilized. And that was one form of eugenics that was applied aggressively. But that is what Hitler used as his model in the 1930s and 33 for the first wave of eugenics laws inside of Nazi Germany. The major financiers behind this, like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Macy Foundation, Josiah Macy Foundation was another big one, that were sponsoring the science, this was something you could get a degree for. It was actually, seen as a very normal thing, and even bad for your career if you questioned the science of eugenics. It was that ingrained as a scientific consensus. People became disgusted with this. So Hitler modeled his eugenics laws off of what the West had already been doing, and he just went further, and gave it much more support. So people were rightfully disgusted when the results of this policy became publicized in 44, 45, 46, and people saw what were the horrors that befell the world because of this, and it gave eugenics a very bad name. And a few years ago, I had read an article, not an article, I had read something that a friend had sent me. It was a PDF of the UNESCO, the United Nations Science and Cultural Education, Science and Cultural Organization Manifesto, its purpose and philosophy, written by Julian Huxley, it's a stark. I mean, I encourage people can get this easily online, and that's what I used to found the basis of this first article in my series on making the unthinkable become thinkable. And in it, Huxley is very clear. And again, just read the first 20 pages of this 90-page or so essay, that the purpose of UNESCO and of the entire post-war system has to be to make eugenics, which he says is the most important of all sciences. It's the king of all sciences, is eugenics. It's become unthinkable, and we have to find a way to retool it so that this can become again thinkable. And that's his words. And also to liberate people's minds from the belief in nationalism, which is holding back an enlightened age, he says, and get them to accept a world government that would then be able to carry us into a new age of harmony and peace. But again, what kind of age of harmony and peace is this if you want eugenics to be your governing science of population control? So this is something which, it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't just Julian Huxley and UNESCO in 46, but the World Health Organization. When you read some of the writings of its first director general, who was a Tavistock social engineer, a psychiatrist named G. Brock Chisholm, it's bone, but I mean, it turns your stomach, because I mean, here's a guy who's a devout believer in not only world government, that's the purpose of the World Health Organization, to bring about an understanding that we need a healthy global system under a one world government, but also to liberate children from the belief in right and wrong that have been put into their minds by old people with old convictions from an obsolete age of mental sickness. Which he associates directly to nationalism, family traditions, religious dogmas. These are all obsolete, and these, he says, are the cause of mental sickness. So the purpose of psychiatry and psychoanalysis, in his mind, is to cleanse the young generation who are being born after World War II, especially from this. And being somebody who had worked with Tavistock, this is a dubious thing. And one of the key guys who was his employer at Tavistock is this guy, Brigadier General John Rawlings Rees. He becomes the head of the World Federation of Mental Health, set up in that same year by UNESCO and the World Health Organization. So these two organizations team up, they create the World Federation of Mental Health. Who Rawlings Rees is now on the board, and he's a guy who, again, managed Tavistock. This was an organization set up as sort of the psychiatric wing of British intelligence in the early 1920s. He took charge in 1930. It was primarily, it was funded by the Macy Foundation, the same organization with the Rockefellers that were funding eugenics, people like Ernst Rudin, who was doing genetics research under Nazi Germany. And one of the focuses that they were looking at in Tavistock was, how do you deconstruct a human being's mind so that they can be reconstructed as the blank slate from scratch? So they were operating the model that a human being is kind of like a machine, that you could like erase the mainframe, erase the operating system, and just reprogram the machine if it's not operating the way you like it. That's been their model even before modern machine technology or computing technology was developed as it is today. That was always their philosophical model. It was John Locke. It was this idea that human beings are fundamentally, there's nothing intrinsic to the human soul. There's just, we're to be written upon by whoever is controlling the levers of society. And that is all we are. The sum of the parts is just on what is written. So they wanted to see, okay, well, they were looking at shock therapy. So people who had been traumatized by World War I were their first case studies that they were looking at throughout the 1920s. And they found these groups fascinating because they'd been through terrible things, torments that no human being should ever experience. And they found that this particular grouping of people who had been shell-shocked, were highly malleable, highly suggestible. They were easily disassociated from their former identities. And, if you're somebody looking at human beings like lab rats, you're like, oh, this is fascinating. We can use this knowledge. Yeah. How can we extend this? And they started increasingly looking at group psychology. So they took that knowledge and they were thinking, okay, what are different ways we can manage a group to have similar type of malleability functions? And a lot of the work that they did was also in children. Even today, one thing I was caught by is that even in just last year, there's a big scandal in the Tavistock clinic today, yes. Over all of these transgendered kids who are being encouraged by the psychiatrists at Tavistock, which have experienced like a 400% increase in transgender therapy and surgery of kids under the age of 18. And they're all being told, yeah, this is what you should be doing, compared to like just 4 years ago. And a bunch of psychiatrists quit because they were like repulsed. They were saying that we're actually making these kids, we're encouraging these kids to go in this direction before they've even fully formed their own identity. So you can see that they're still doing really shady stuff with the human psyche even today, but that's what they were doing back then. So this is what G. Brock Chisholm, this is what Brigadier General Rawlings Rees, who are shaping these post-World War II organizations with Julian Huxley, the eugenicist, who's also, he becomes the president of the British Eugenic Society. All of these guys are formulating these things, clearly laying out what their view of a healthy world order is going to be, and putting it into motion, to the point that, even like Whitney Webb made a recent point that many of the organizations working with Oxford's AstraZeneca are things like the Galton Institute, which was just the British Eugenic Society renamed in 1989. Or the Human Sterilization Society for Human Betterment, which was renamed the Engender Health in the 80s. Or no, that was renamed earlier. That was a really bad name. But it's the same friggin' organization, and it's working directly with the Oxford AstraZeneca groups, and there's other ones too. So there's just a direct continuity. So I think that was the overarching drive for that paper, and especially when you hear the writings of. I had listened to the proceedings of, or some of the proceedings of this big CRISPR conference in 2015, which was sort of the first historic conference unveiling human genetic modification technologies with CRISPR, that had come out of the Human Genome Project under Eric Lander, who's today the science czar under Biden. He's a Rhodes Scholar mathematician who became a biophysicist, or a biologist, which is never a good match. And so he ran the Human Genome Project. They made certain discoveries in terms of how do you manipulate the human genome, CRISPR came out of this research using E. coli that could then be vectored to target certain DNA sequences to introduce certain mutations that you might want to have or suppress, which could be a good thing, frankly. I'm not against the technology intrinsically. Under good humanistic hands, feasibly, this could do a lot of good, maybe for humanity. That has to be discussed. But the point is, when you look at the psychology of these characters who are coming out saying, we have made the unthinkable become thinkable, and that's what what's his name, David Baltimore, Eric Lander's former boss at the Whitehead Institute, he came out. That was his keynote address, the CRISPR conference. And then you just look at how these people are defining human beings literally as a sum of parts, kind of like a machine, the same way these eugenicists did. It's a bad formulation of thinking. So there, that was
and the bad formulation, when you bad ideas lead to bad consequences, and through everything you've been saying and the reading your articles, you mentioned the psychology of these people, and the psychology is very interesting because they seem to have, well, there's many components to it, but one is their view of human nature. So you mentioned it, that they see human nature as this infinitely malleable thing, is that we can figure out how to shape humanity in our best image, according to our criteria. But then along with that, well, inherent in that is this supreme egotism or arrogance that they know the best way to do it, that they have the criteria. And so this is the recipe for disaster, because I'm with you. I'm not against necessarily any of these technologies or even some of the ideas or the intentions behind the ideas. But when you combine that with a person who thinks that they know the truth about how this can happen and how it should be done, and then have these massive organizations that can then implement a policy on millions of people, then that can and does lead to, well, if the idea is bad to begin with, then that will have negative results for tons of people. So getting back to what you were saying about Huxley and one of the other guys and their criteria, that we wanted to essentially eliminate people's natural inclinations towards family life and religion and old beliefs and patriotism, and we'll just get rid of all that to create a better human.
Yeah.
Without considering that, well, maybe those things are actually expressions of what human nature actually is, and maybe by trying to mess with that, you will actually create a monster. And look what happened, in Hitler's Germany. That I think you could say that was a Frankenstein monster that got created there. So there's this strange worldview, this kind of arrogant elitism that we know how to shape the world, and when you have a professional elite class with this kind of outlook and the ability to put it into place, well, you were talking about this idea of the human personality, looking at people suffering, soldiers suffering from shell shock or PTSD, and it's oh, well, what can we learn from this? It's the same thing that they did with Pavlov in because Pavlov was a great researcher, and he found out some very important things. He was a great physiologist and actually a good psychologist in his later years. But well, in the system that he was living under, the focus was on the materialistic aspects of his insights into human nature and on animals, and the transfer from that information on animals to humans, that about transmarginal inhibition. He's talking about that when you stress out an animal enough, and same goes with the humans, you can break down their mind, and that puts them in such a state that they can kind of then be something new can be born out of it. Well, it's true, but there are limits to it. But also, in what hands are these things being done? And you made one reference. I actually wanted to ask you about this. You made one reference to MK Ultra, because this is essentially what the MK Ultra program, or parts of it, were all about. Were subjecting people to drugs and abuse and various types of environmental stimuli to break them down and to create something new. Of course, they had one of their ideas was the Manchurian Candidate, to be able to create the perfect spy that you could create an alter personality in, that could then go and run missions, and then they would forget about it. But it was all based on this idea that the human mind could be broken down and then reborn from the ashes of the disintegration that was implemented.
Yeah.
But it was an offhand reference to MK Ultra. I think you mentioned it in reference to being funded by or run by the same people involved in UNESCO and WHO. I just wondered if that was more of an offhand comment, or if you'd found some ties between these organizations and that CIA program.
Yeah, no, there definitely were. The Macy Foundation in this whole story plays a very important role. And some of the characters, there's overlap. Like, for example, Gregory Bateson, who becomes a leading figure in MK Ultra, is also working very closely with his wife, Margaret Mead, at the World Federation of Mental Health. She's actually the president of the World Federation of Mental Health for 2 years in 1952-53 at the apex of MK Ultra, when it was just kicking off. There's a lot of funding that is going through different black channels. I mean, even to this very day, there's a certain amount of opacity regarding like where the funding was actually coming from. We've identified different aspects of it. A lot of it was private foundations. But the research, the application of the research that was conducted and pioneered at Tavistock was used to guide a lot of the work being done in the MK Ultra experiments that were happening in all over North America. A big center of this was in Canada, in Montreal, where you had the Allen Memorial Institute. And here we had a guy named Ewan Cameron, who was a major sociopathic psychiatrist who just he destroyed so many lives. And even today, there's lawsuits from survivors and families who, these are people who went in for, they had depression, postpartum depression, things like that. And he would just go for maximum mixtures of LSD, other forms of psychotropic drugs mixed with electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, just to see what is needed to finally break the person into an empty shell, where they could be created with from a healthy personality type. And as a side note, Naomi Klein wrote a book. I don't really like Naomi Klein, but she had a big research team, like 30 people working on this book called Shock Doctrine. And the first 3 chapters of that go through MK Ultra, and it makes the point as well that there was always a self-awareness by a lot of the leading figures running MK Ultra, which went on for about 20 years officially. It was officially disbanded in 73, but one could say it was just sort of normalized and changed gears in the 70s. But it was always designed to bring about shock therapy to nations, and this is sort of what guided a lot of the decision-making and policy-making for the Pinochet, the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, or Raul Goulart in Brazil a little bit earlier, which were, Kissinger, Bechtel, Schultz engineered regime changes back then to impose a massive shock on the people, a massive cleansing of the intellectuals, of people who would be resistance, break their will, and then bring about a privatized open market system controlled by the Western financiers in London and Wall Street. This is what they also did in Russia later on in the 90s. But so the idea was always to apply this on a broader sociological level globally, to bring about a certain desired behavioral modification. And people like Ewan Cameron is in constant correspondence with William Sargent, who wrote Battlefield of the Mind, for example, a major manual for these psychiatrists throughout the decades to undermine Western civilization. I mean, to put it frankly. And that's a Tavistockian fellow, like William Sargent is directly working with Tavistock. G. Brock Chisholm and Ewan Cameron are in constant dialogue. They're constantly sharing their data and their information. So it's sort of like an enmeshment of multiple organizations that are overlapping with certain controllers at nodes that manage it. So not everybody knows what the whole is doing. Yeah. And I think that gets at the other part of how this sort of thing tends to operate, is that one of the key figures that I identified in part 3 in my article to understand this new fetish, this new sort of awakening, where you have people like Ray Kurzweil, who's a high level Google director, an inventor, and he's a big futurist, a transhumanist, sorry, who speaks a lot about the singularity, the point where human beings merge with machines, or Yuval Harari. He's another like sort of darling of the World Economic Forum, one of their spokesman philosophers to sort of popularize the transhumanist agenda, where we're going to be entering a new useless class where AI is going to render human beings effectively useless unless we merge with machines again. Or Elon Musk's Neuralink, same agenda. Facebook has a big orientation towards this too. It's a bit of a fantasy, but there's a big fetish around this idea of, like I said, playing God, where people like Yuval Harari say, okay, there has been no cause, no directionality, no purposefulness. He's an atheist, he's proud of it, to the universe or to mankind until now. Now is the first time through all of this random mutation and randomness that we've come to a moment where intelligent design is finally going to govern the show. But the intelligent designers will not be God. It will be the people running Google, he says, and Facebook. That's his words, like he's like just try to kiss ass to his masters. But they really do have this godlike view. And I think that the denial of the existence of the human soul, as you pointed out, people like you and Cameron devoutly were opposed to the idea that there was a soul, that there is a soul, that there's a reason for us to feel connections to family, bonds to the past, hopes for the future. Like all of these things are ephemeral. They're not real. So they all have this machine-like view of human nature. And I think that this indicates that they themselves are also sick. Like they're the ones who are ironically in need of this, psychiatric help.
It's an expression of their own like internal landscape. So, and then they project that internal landscape onto others. So you see this with a lot of philosophers in the, going back to, I can just list a few. Like there was Hobbes, of course, and even I don't know about Machiavelli himself, but the Machiavellian philosophy. You can go back to Joseph de Maistre and then even
purgative violence. Yeah.
And then I always, it's a tough name, but he was the advisor to the three last czars, Pobodinastsav, I think his name was. He was pretty much had a worldview exactly like Hobbes or Meister, and then Herbert Marcuse in the Frankfurt School, and a lot of these philosophers, Karl Marx, they have this view. This, you could call it this kind of like hollowed out view of human nature that, and you look at a lot of their personal lives, like Karl Marx wasn't really an upstanding type of guy, didn't have a very healthy family life, and so you look at the type of lives. If you could peer into the private lives of a lot of these guys today, I think there'd be some surprises when you see how they actually live their lives. But their own internal psychology is probably the sickest, and then it's their writings and their ideas that then have the effect of going out into the world and creating mayhem. So in a funny way, it's almost like a lot of what they're saying is true, but if it was applied to them and not all the other people that they think that this should be applied to, it's like, maybe we should isolate you guys, on some island somewhere, so that you can't affect anyone, and maybe not have children, and then everyone else can just live their lives like they should. That I think maybe that would have a more positive effect on the world.
Well, yeah, that's a very ironic twist where I agree with what you're saying. Like pretty much anything and everything that they're talking about doing to the wider population, it should really be inversed, where it really only applies to them, and then it would probably be fine, and the world would be better off.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, the amount of dichotomization that they have, both in terms of cutting themselves off from the process that they're trying to control and manipulate. They don't consider themselves part of the system that they want to control, which is why you get things like these disturbing quotes by Bertrand Russell, talking about the two layers of education that need to be sort of solidified and crystallized in this healthy world order, this healthy scientific dictatorship where students can be convinced that snow is black. This famous quote. But Bertrand Russell is very clear that for the education for the elites, for the masters, we have to encourage initiative and courage and innovation. These are like things that we want to cherish, as long as there's always a loyalty to their caste. And if that loyalty is broken, off to the killing chamber. Sorry. And then he says, for the education system for the masses, for those who will be, he doesn't say it, but the slave class, the Morlocks, sort of. But for that mass education, we have to encourage passivity, complacency, adaptability to popular opinion, consensus. These are virtues that we want to encourage as the ideal of that education system. And then he also has, this is in his Scientific Outlook in 1930, where he has this addendum where he's like, but sometimes the social engineers will encounter the odd case where a student from the lower caste will exhibit genius qualities that would make them applicable for membership of the higher ruling class. What do we do in those situations? And he says, well, after they're thoroughly tested through and through, if they should pass their tests and give up loyalty to their previous caste, then we should accept them in and welcome them in. And if they don't, and they fail their tests, then he loves this, off to the killing chamber. It's like, you serious?
So then you're really self-selecting for high IQ psychopathy, essentially, is what they would be doing. Just, further entrench, who and what they are and what they're trying to do. And that made me think of, in terms of the education that you had talked about, and I think it was in the third article, maybe, where you were talking about how, what was it, guilt and popular opinion were going to be used as tools to educate and to keep people in line. And I thought that was a very poignant thing to point out, considering just what's going on with all of the critical race theory, re-education and sensitivity training and all of those sorts of things, which are really just doing exactly that. To create a permanent caste of a sort where you are forever guilty of being white, and you should feel guilty about it and be subservient, or Asian, or you
name it, right? Pick a category and you could find a reason to be guilty about it. And that was, again, the Josiah Macy Foundation with the World Federation of Mental Health co-sponsored for 2 years a series of conferences, seminars, and practical application of teaching methods in Germany in 1948, 49, 50, 51, I think it went up to. And they were applying this now to completely organize the transformation of the German educational system. And it was largely under the guidance of Kurt Lewin, who was a Frankfurt School psychiatrist. He ran a lot of this research. And I go through that a little bit in the article. But essentially, the idea was to convince the entire population, especially starting with the young, that the fault of Nazism in World War II was the Fourth Reich gene, that there's something embedded in the German persona genetically, wired into their DNA, which is fascist, warlike, imperialistic. And the idea was to control via guilt. One of the techniques that the Frankfurt School, but especially Tavistock, innovated, people like Eric Trist is a big person in this, major influential person in this, were techniques to conduct mass brainwashing sessions in groups. So you can basically have like a teacher, for example, in a classroom wouldn't be a teacher, it would be sort of somebody who would be a facilitator of bringing the group into a consensus. And what the techniques that would be utilized by these facilitators would be placed in bureaucracies and unions. And this is what happened throughout the 1950s, 60s. The entire United Nations and OECD bureaucracies were built up around these organizing principles. Was guilt, shame, if you sort of try to find ways of bringing out conflict, And if there's anybody within the group who exhibits self-directedness, a capacity to question what the group is thinking or to question one of the underlying rules that you're trying to get the group to adhere to, you can channel the group's energy onto that individual, that student who's being creative, and work on shaming them. Get the group to turn on the person so that you break their will and get them to ultimately acquiesce to the new condition. And once they do that, they lose something of themselves. The more they get into the habit of acquiescing and giving up their sovereignty to get groupthink. And increasingly, like these groups also sponsored things with the Frankfurt School. The Macy Foundation was, again, a big funder of this study published in 4950. The authoritarian personality came out of this research, that anybody who asserts that they have a knowledge of a truth of something are a potential fascist and Nazi. So you can't trust anybody like that. So obviously, yes, fascists do think that they have absolute truth of things. Yes, that's true. But does that mean everybody who thinks that they know a truth, like Martin Luther King Jr., who says truths, does that make him a fascist? Well, in their mind, yes. And so applied to research and development, the engineering schools, and as well as people at Bell Labs, other things, started applying these new techniques that encouraged groupthink in science as well, so that cells of scientists were set up to co-think through things, and individual genius, individual initiative was discouraged. That was flushed out. That was to be subdued, because it creates problems, disequilibrium in the system you're trying to control. And what these guys want, looking at people like Julian Huxley, Norbert Wiener was a student of Bertrand Russell, but Bertrand Russell himself as well. A lot of these people who are these social engineers, they're all trying to model a highly controlled system, and a deterministic system of humanity. But at the same time, they need to get the system to behave like a stochastic process in its parts. So like, a stochastic process is just like the random molecules inside of like a can of spray paint, kind of random. There's a randomness function in the moving of the molecules as you're heating up the gas. But what's the boundary conditions of the gas are the structure of the can. So they need everybody to sort of act as closely as possible to randomize stochastic particles in the system. But they have defined the system to be entropic, a closed system. That's what they say humanity is. They say, okay, we can be defined as an absolutely closed system. And because it is closed, there's a finite amount of energy to go around to move and maintain the parts. And as the parts continue to move and use that limited energy, you get a diminishing return to all. This is like the old idea that they retweaked of John Stuart Mill, John Stuart Mill's approach to economics, that there's a diminishing return to each individual over a time function as you draw down the economic resources. So that system is always moving in a predictable way towards a heat death of the system, an ultimate inability to maintain the system, like your gas tank would be after it uses up all of the gasoline. It burns it all to move the pistons, and at a certain point, it's not going to make new gas. That's the sort of thinking that they've been trying to impose onto society. Now, the problem is when you have individual initiative, when you have individuals who are inspired, like Max Planck or Einstein or Madame Curie, or pick a genius, right? Individuals tend to break their mold. They tend to, when inspired by certain ideas of transcendental concepts of love of truth more than love of personal pleasure, of thinking of your progeny, the greater good. There's concepts like this that the positivist, the materialist would say, oh, these are just metaphysical garbage. It's illusion. But it's like, is it? Because every time I see examples of people who are motivated by these things, they produce empirically validatable discoveries that are translatable into ways that create more energy in the system. All of a sudden, I could sustain more people by the application of the discovery of the nature or structure of electricity, an application of that in the form of technological progress that I didn't have when I was ignorant of that knowledge, right? It was a phenomenon that was there in nature, but we didn't know of it, so we couldn't use it. And populations were always subjected to former resource limits. So we had a limited carrying capacity. So that's where I think that they've always, and this is where it gets dirty, because they know what they're doing. I mean, at that level, they know that they're doing something unnatural by trying to smother out the love of family, the love of nation, the love of humanity, metaphysics, personal genius, like all of these things. They know it's unnatural, but they do it anyway because they need to smother that for their formulas to work, of randomized stochastic moments of everybody just thinking about personal fleshly pleasures in the moment. Don't think about the past. Don't trust anybody over 30. Don't think about the future. You'll be dead then, says George Bush Jr., you know? And meanwhile, the people who are thinking about those things are just the small few, groups of within the accepted governing caste at the top who can see what the whole is doing. Nobody else has to see what the whole is doing because they're so busy myopically being blinded by the identity you've given them, crushing their will in school. And, they don't have the passion to care, and they don't have the ability intellectually to even see what they're a part of. They don't think about context. And thus you don't need to have everybody in on the conspiracy. You're right. It's a self-controlling system that needs very little input by the social engineers increasingly over time.
And that seems to be kind of the just the overarching theme for, I guess, millennia, you could say, where it seems to me that mode of thinking and being is what it is. It is just something that exists. These people have existed for millennia. They will continue to exist until, something drastic happens and changes. But it doesn't matter, eugenics has changed form. Mm-hmm. Malthusianism has changed form. But the essence of it, the essential idea has never gone away. And that's what reading your articles really kind of made clear to me, was how all of the stuff is just drapery on the window that has forever been, which is there's a certain select percentage of the population who are looking to control and order society in their own image and for their own means and ends, and will constantly look to justify it by any and every means necessary available to them at the time. And so that changes. In the 1700s, 1800s, there was Malthusianism, and then later on it changed to a social Darwinian concept, and now it's changed to a critical race theory type situation. Transhumanism. And so it constantly changes as the times change, but the essence of it remains the same.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's so useful when you approach history from the standpoint of an organism, right? Like we as human beings, we are in many ways, we can find analogs to nature in the sense that, like light has both a wave-like and particle-like quality to it. And in many ways, human beings, we can learn a lot by looking at that metaphor, in the sense that we all are finite. We're born in time. There's a moment before which we didn't really exist, after which we won't exist as identities. But during this time frame, we act, we live, we use our time in a certain way, or we invest our energy, and we may or may not contribute to the overarching wave of the human civilization, the continuity, right? This continuous, non-discrete process of the flow and flux of humanity. Some people contribute greatly. They amplify that wave, and they contribute a lot to it. Like a Benjamin Franklin type of persona used their time really well. They didn't waste time, and they contributed back into the system after they departed, that still will have a durable effect long after they're dead. And then a lot of people, unfortunately, that right to be a part of, to participate of ourselves back into the wave, it's been removed from us. It's been stolen from us because of the existence of this oligarchical parasitical thing, this continuity of this self-organized master, self-described master elite class, right? That you could find traces back to even like Plato's Republic in book 6, where Plato describes exactly how this thing works. He does like a real big no-no for the elite, by demonstrating the cave allegory, which is, he's exposing it. He's like, this is exactly, he doesn't say it. He doesn't have the liberty in the world that he lives in to just come out and say things directly. And I don't think he would even do it that way if he could, because you don't make a discovery by just telling somebody a crystallized answer. You have to sort of awaken cognitive dissonances. You have to induce a question first, right? And get the mind to move. But what he does by building up to the cave allegories, he demonstrates a scenario where people have lived their whole lives shackled with their necks forced to just look at a cave wall with shadows cast by an elite who emits sounds and shadows and move little objects. And the people are you pity them, right? They think that is reality. And he has the situation where one person, by whatever means, is now released, and they find their way out of the cave to see that there's a higher light beyond simply the fire, but there's a light of the sun outside of the cave. And at first they want to instinctually kind of go back into the cave where they're comfortable. But if they're courageous and they fight it out, they learn to adjust their eyes to see grass as it is and to see the light of the real world. And he makes the point that if you want to be qualified as a real philosopher, and this is what a lot of the Neoplatonists today, people who call themselves Platonists, but are not really, who are occupying seats in Cambridge or Oxford, or Leo Strauss of the neocon, the neocon teacher, he calls himself a Platonist. No, they like that part where you have an idea of an elitist philosopher who could see the transcendental nature of reality, and you can then understand how to manipulate the shadows of the people who are in the cave. But Plato makes the point, if you want to be a real lover of wisdom, a real philosopher, you got to go back into the cave, despite the fact that people might want to kill you, by helping them become aware that their senses are not giving them reality. So that's the challenging part that people run away from. But you have traces of this oligarchical thing throughout history, and every time humanity organizes itself in a certain way towards, there's these moments where you can see that the potential for a creative evolutionary upshift is so high. One in part 2 of my series, I zero in on this one moment, which is a useful historical inflection point that is very important to understand. It's been almost completely written out of our history books after the Civil War. And that was a moment when, not only did the British Empire exert all of its power and influence and money and everything to try to destroy the Union and undo the American Revolution from 80 years prior, British intelligence were helping out the Confederate South. British Canada was this is the Confederate Secret Society headquarters, where we carried out the assassination of Lincoln from Montreal, Canada. We were conducting things like the Albany raids from British Canada on behalf of the Confederacy the entire time. And the only thing that stopped that from going towards complete dismemberment of the Union back then was that Russia stepped in under Alexander II, the Great Liberator, and offered the Russian fleets as a direct message to the British imperialists and French imperialists, who were prepared to openly come out fully backing the Confederacy. And that was a message that if you do that, that's a casus belli for Russia as well. And that kept them sort of subdued. So coming out of that process, Britain had exerted itself. It had wasted itself on opium wars, suppressing Indian rebellions in 1859-60. The Crimean Wars were huge expenditure to destroy Russia by sucking them into an unwinnable war in the Middle East against the Ottomans, which were teamed up with the French and the British. That was 56 that it ended, 57. And Britain was really not getting a lot of respect at that point. People were kind of waking up to this spider that had been just like lighting fires everywhere. I don't know if that's what spiders do, but anyway, people were waking up to the nature of the counterintelligence methods of this Iago style operation that the British had honed over many years. And I don't say the British because it's not the British people, but British intelligence, which took over Britain back in 1688. From Venice and from Amsterdam. But anyway, that's a longer story. But people were waking up to this evil, this Iago type of evil that would induce people to destroy themselves. And from 1870, 1880, 1890, you had the spread globally of this other non-British system, this system that was then known as the American system of political economy. And when you read the writings of Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry C. Carey, which I cite heavily in my works, like Unity of Law, not only is he taking direct aim at Darwin, at Huxley, at Mill, at Bentham, at Malthus, he's always targeting these guys, but he's making the point that real economics must not be founded upon the worship of money, but rather on the cherishing of the human mind. How do you use money at the service of the nature of mind to make discoveries and translate those in new forms of technological progress, which requires the American system was always based not upon British free trade, which was, if you look at Adam Smith, he published his Wealth of Nations in 1776 on the commission of Lord Shelburne, who was the head of British intelligence. The idea was to always create a logical, scientific justification why nation states should never intervene on private financial interests and regulate or protect their financial system. Just do what you're good at. If you have a lot of land, that's what you do. That said Adam Smith. That's the British system. Don't develop manufacturing. That's for Britain to do. Now, ignore the fact that Britain actually didn't use free trade to develop its manufacturing, but so everybody if you have slaves, you just use slaves. That's what you do as a cotton plantation. You don't need industry. You don't need infrastructure so everybody would just do cash cropping, and you make your money that way. You buy low, sell dear. There's certain rules of how human behavior and economic behavior worked under his system of hidden hands, invisible, mysterious hands regulating things somehow. Don't think about it. Don't worry. That's for God to think about it. You don't think about it. You're just a human being. You're a worm. So the American system was based on the use of protectionism, the directed flow of credit towards infrastructure, the Erie Canal, the transcontinental railways. So things that would require many years to build. You couldn't just do it for purely greed purposes. But you wanted to still, it's not communism because you want to still encourage private initiative and private enterprise. So you're giving contracts to private companies to build things, to do things that are real. And money is both for your individual personal interest as well as the interest of the whole. So you want to it's a way of cultivating the character of the people towards uniting their individual self-interest with the general welfare, which is the ideal. That's the only way democracy could ever work, if you have that orientation. So Henry C. Carey is working with people all over the world, with Tsar Alexander II and his network in Russia. Sergei Witte, the transport minister and prime minister of Russia, is applying the American system with scientists like Mendeleev, Dmitry, who discovers the periodic table. Mendeleev is in America for several months in the 1876 Centennial Exhibition. And he's studying the American system, and he's made the chairman of the Committee on the Protective Tariff for Russia. This is the scientist, right? He's a total Russian patriot, and he's working with these guys to bring in and build the Trans-Siberian Railway with locomotives built in Philadelphia, Baltimore locomotives. Otto von Bismarck is doing the same thing in Germany, creating the Zollverein, the customs union, with a protective tariff, to unify for the first time the German states under a real unified nation, but vectored on these American system principles of internal developments, long-term credit. The Meiji Restoration is beginning to do the same thing with Henry C. Carey's collaborator, E. Peshine Smith, who's an American economist in Beijing, becomes the advisor to the government, and they're unveiling Baldwin locomotives in Japan. Francis Sédigue Carnot, the president, who was later assassinated in 1895, he's also applying the same thing. And you got this all over the world. In Argentina, you got it's named the Dragos Plan. The foreign minister is a follower of Carey, and doing the same thing in South America, Brazil. Same thing is happening. So globally, you have this. What the empire is petrified of at this point is the disintegrating effect of sovereign nation states blossoming all over the world like little fires that they can't put out anymore. They're trying to they were trying to snuff them, but they're just like popping up left and right. It's these creative fires of sovereign expression where nations are developing full spectrum economies. And you could read the writings of a lot of these guys. H.G. Wells talks about this crisis of the empire, how this had to be stopped. And who's H.G. Wells? I mean, he's not only a founder of predictive programming in the 1890s and onward, but he's a leading Fabian Society ideologue. He's a student of Thomas Huxley, a direct student under the normal school in London under Huxley, one of his prodigies. And Huxley is one of the key guys who's who diagnoses the problem of the empire. Why are they incapable of generating the creative solution to this problem? I think we actually talked about, I'm getting deja vu. We talked about this in our last interview. They got too comfortable with their hegemony, and the elite class became too stagnant and decadent and didn't have the ability to have that mental flexibility to deal with the problem of human creativity. So Huxley, he was like a low birthed, somebody from a low blood, low quality, dirty family in the mind of an imperialist, but he was really misanthropic and creative, and he was adopted by the system. He was recruited to become one of the like management consultants, I guess you could say. If your business is in a crisis, you might want to hire a management consulting firm to evaluate the structure and do reforms to see if you can rehabilitate the business. And that's sort of what the British East India Company, the City of London, all of that, it's one integrated business, so-called, it's like and they had to do a reform, a cleansing out. So what was done was the need to, as part of the Royal Society, and he was appointed with a lot of privileges to organize something called the X Club. He became the controller of a figure named Charles Darwin, whose grandpa was a really good guy, but he got corrupted over time, I guess, or a little misanthropic, I should say. Corrupted, I don't know. Darwin's not a bad guy. He's sympathetic. But anyway, Thomas Huxley's job was to come up with a scientific system that would validate the British Empire's continuity, and to under the X Club in 1865 was to bring together the leading scientists of Britain, who each had different fields of specialization in chemistry and sociology and philosophy and everything, and bring them together to create a unified, internally consistent body of knowledge that would then would have certain characteristics, like the elimination of all ideas of creative leaps in nature, that there would be a gradualist interpretation of nature, that it would be that the idea of the subjective and objective would be a wall would be imposed upon the scientist and nature, so that nature would be, and science would be, something that would be purely descriptive in nature. The role of the person looking at nature would no longer be considered a part of it, which was actually how a lot of the greatest discoveries were made, was that people were thinking about how they were thinking about the process that they're trying to understand. That's what the continentalist school of people like Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who created a massive scientific movement. It was all based upon the internal aesthetical, subjective qualities being reflected in nature as well. That because we're made in the image of nature, we're part of nature. So why would these things not be also embedded in some form in nature? Is how they were all thinking. So this is what Darwinism was a useful model, an explanatory model of biology that was based on gradualism, no creative leaps, randomness in the small. So all qualitative attributes that would grow and emerge in fossil records would be accounted for simply by slow gradualism, and randomness. So that there'd just be like a random function of mutation happening on some level that would just be like trying random things out. And every once in a while, something would, like, the dice would roll just right and it would work. And that would account for why things progress, as the weaker would be subdued by the stronger. But Darwin admits in his writing that he was inspired by reading Thomas Malthus's essays on population. That's what gave him the theory by which to work, he says, in 1838, when he's like, I didn't know what to do. And then I read Malthus's theory by which societies progress by the strong beating out the weaker in a world of diminishing returns. And then he was like, yes, that's it. And Wallace describes the same thing, Alfred Wallace. So, this was obviously very useful for people like Huxley and his controllers as a system that anyway. So the X Club was the first sort of major think tank run out of the Royal Society, as well as in Cambridge, what became sort of the node of the new system's controls. And out of that emerged slight tweaks with social Darwinism. Herbert Spencer was one of the participants of these X Club meetings. They created things like Nature magazine as a propaganda instrument to promote their Darwinistic view, at the expense of all of the other theories of biology, which were actually, we're told it's either Darwinism or nothing, or you're a creationist. It's like, no, not really. When you look at what other scientists were actually making penetrating discoveries into biology with this Humboldtian idea of a creative directedness, a purposefulness in the universe. James Dwight Dana was looking at cephalization, and Lamarck had there's a lot of value there. There's Cuvier and Carl Ernst von Baer, who's looking at morphogenetic fields of a certain sort, how the whole is being organized by certain harmonics of the body, which are tied to the harmonics of the biosystem of nature. So there's all these fruitful discoveries that are being brushed aside as crazy creationism, and only scientific, Darwinism is true. But then Herbert Spencer adds to that by extrapolating that back onto human society, that we eventually, just weed out the weeds in the garden of, of the weak being beaten out by the strong. And then Galton comes out, the cousin of Darwin, and develops that a little bit further in the form of eugenics, which wins over Darwin. Darwin's like, yeah, you've made a total convert out of me. And Darwin, I said he's a sympathetic guy because, he really does, I think, want to figure things out. He doesn't know or fully understand how he's being used for political purposes. And he describes, later on in his life, writing to a family member, this sad thing where he's like, I used to feel joy in my younger years for the poetry of Keats. I used to find joy in music, and I can't find joy in any of these things anymore. And he says, he's self-conscious. Like, I think maybe it's my overly developed analytical brain. And, it's sad. It's tragic. But so these guys are all essentially taking, as you said, the system of empire that was already there for thousands of years. And they're just simply, like, Thomas Malthus is inspired by Hobbes. He's a Hobbesian. Hobbes is just the Leviathan. We always need like one singular Leviathan to control the chaos of the selfish individual bits and parts and particles of the masses within the system. That's the only way we can get order. And if that's your idea of the good governance is order and equilibrium, mathematical stability, then any type of creative innovation that offsets the equilibrium is bad. That becomes evil, So that's what the unfortunate thing is. It turns you actually evil. If you believe in those assumptions, then you have to make the conclusions that Thomas Malthus makes in his essay on population, first edition, where he says, we have to court the plague. We have to use the gifts that nature gave us of war and starvation and pandemics as a responsible scientific manager in order to keep checks on population. We have to dispose of poor babies if room can't be made for them by the deaths of old persons. You have to, unfortunately, encourage those things to happen. So not everybody who thinks like a Malthusian or a eugenicist or today transhumanist, they're not in on it. They're not necessarily intrinsically bad people, but the assumptions, the unquestioned assumptions that they have about the nature of the system that they're a part of forces them into certain conclusions about how to manage the over excess of people.
I think that's a crucial point, Matthew, because what you're doing with these articles is you're going back, you're looking at the assumptions based on the assumptions based on the assumptions, and then you take these quotes from guys like Bertrand Russell that you were paraphrasing earlier, where he talks about the two types of people, and if it wasn't there in black and white, you wouldn't believe that these famous figures were actually saying these things so explicitly. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't consider the implications of all of their ways of thinking and the types of policies that they were trying to implement. Mm-hmm. But there they are. I mean, I nearly fell off my chair when I read that. And there are several more that illustrate the point that in the trappings of highly educated, highly connected, highly sophisticated individuals with a great command of language and a matchless network of other people in culture and society and politics, there is this psychopathic will to enforce certain ideas that are anti-human when it comes right down to it.
Yeah,
and to understand that that these figures are kind of pillars, foundational to a lot of the organizations that are calling the shots and making very rapid advancement in medical tyranny, in economics, in globalism. To understand that these were the voices, these were the leading figures that helped kind of set the groundwork for the movements that the juggernauts that are pushing forward in all of these various agendas that we're watching unfold before our very eyes right now. And I like the fact that you put this in the context of the Great Reset and Klaus Schwab. Schwab is part and parcel of this whole lineage of anti-human thinkers who have mastered the language of presenting their policies as progressive and positive and life affirming. When, just to dig a little deeper is to realize that it's so much about control on a massive level. And fortunately, I think we are seeing pockets of light come forward. We are seeing movements. We are seeing more conservative groupings that are, at least in their various corners of influence, speaking out against many of the things that we're seeing. But it's work, and I think everybody is kind of waiting with bated breath a little bit and looking to see where we can make progress or headway in at least stemming the tide of all of these collective movements towards one world policy.
Well, I think one thing that is extraordinarily important in thinking, especially about people like Bertrand Russell, but I mean, these are all people who are celebrated philosophers. He's celebrated as a great pacifist. His history of Western philosophy is still like a source book for most philosophy departments across the world. So his interpretation of also the science history is a standard. His interpretation of what Einstein discovered, Einstein's method, is the standard upon which when people think about what Einstein did, they're often thinking about not Einstein, but Bertrand Russell's interpretation of Einstein, or they're thinking of Leibniz. One of the first things that Bertrand Russell published was a book on Leibniz, on the science of Leibniz's method. He becomes the standard bearer for all of these things. So when people even criticize the problems of Einstein or the problems of Leibniz or many things, or the problems of Western civilization, they're actually not dealing with the thing itself. They're dealing with a scarecrow that's been created, that creates these false debates and discussions with assumptions, like the fact that, Bertrand Russell spent a couple of years in China working with Joseph Needham, one of his colleagues who was part of this operation. And he teaches a class. Mao is a student, a young Mao. They're bringing in the Princeton Skull and Bones operation into a brainwashing operation of the young elites in China, and he is retraining the intelligentsia of China, who become influenced by his interpretation of what is Western civilization. So why are you going to believe this guy who hates Western civilization and is a part of an operation to destroy it? Why are you going to take his word on what Western civilization actually is? But then the belief that there's this absolute wall between like Eastern culture, which is a feeling intuitive culture, versus Western culture, which is this logical, left-brained, Enlightenment civilization. There's this wall of divide between these two worlds that cannot have harmony. That's bullshit. I mean, it's not true at all. And so you look at how the level that Bertrand Russell is operating on is much more subtle, much more long game than a lot of people realize. But that's what people have to, coming out of this process, as we are all born into a sick system. It's so useful to just get into the mind, the top-down thinking of somebody who thinks on that level of a whole. You have to think like a Bertrand Russell to a degree, but think about the sorts of minds who they hate and despise as well. Think like by reading the writings of somebody like a Leibniz, you can get your mindset into a state where you're not just focusing on one thing, but you're looking at how a multitude of different things all intersect in one idea. And that's why people like Leibniz is able to make penetrating breakthroughs in everything he touches. He figures out a way of thinking that allows him to tap into languages. He develops an understanding and application of like 18 languages easily, discovers the infinitesimal calculus, makes penetrating discoveries into history. He's a statesman organizing a grand strategy. He's the founder of the Prussian Academy of Sciences, the German Academy of Sciences. He's made Tsar Peter the Great makes him his privy counselor, and he reorganizes the legal system of Russia as he's organizing the Russian Academy of Sciences, which becomes created a few years after he dies. But people like Leibniz, you can see why Bertrand Russell's ilk are working so hard to take control of the narrative of what a Leibniz is, because Leibniz is also organizing. He's on the verge of becoming the prime minister of the woman who's going to become the heir to the British throne, Sophie of Hanover, who's his student. And she's like next in line for the throne of Britain after Queen Anne dies. And he's working with different anti-imperialist groups like Robert Harley, who's the Prime Minister of England, Jonathan Swift, who's working with Harley to create a national Bank of England, a national land bank, in opposition to breaking the control of the Bank of England that had just been set up after the Glorious Revolution in 1694. So these guys are all trying to bring back a real patriotic, humanistic policy-making process within Britain, in opposition to this parasitical thing trying to then take over. And Leibniz is in the middle of so many things. He's working with missionaries who are tied to the Chinese government under Emperor Kangxi Emperor. And he's having, back and forths with these groups, looking at, well, what are the different scientific discoveries in Asia. I mean, so Leibniz discovers and creates the first calculating machines using a binary system that he develops from the I Ching. He develops a grand strategy of infrastructure worked out that he's writing about the Russian-Chinese alliance that could build infrastructure together, great works with a focus on science, on arts, on creativity, like unifying these different domains of human thought into institutions that would transcend individual lives. And he's an institution creator. And his view of this in his writings on China, he actually has a Chinese magazine called Nova Cinema. I can't pronounce it. Anyway, it's a Latin name, but it's basically his news on China. And he's writing his strategies for breaking the control of oligarchy by getting these different cultures to unify, to work together on building great projects together that would uplift everybody in between Russia and China and also Europe. He's having interactions with John Winthrop in America, who's also a leading scientist. And he's having thousands of correspondences, cutting edge stuff. So Bertrand Russell, I think this is the thing. To understand the growth of AI, what I try to get to in part 3 of my series is you got to look at Bertrand Russell's project, which he sets up in 1900 at a Future of Mathematics conference. So he's working with this guy, David Hilbert. And Bertrand Russell and Hilbert together launch a program to try to mathematize all of science. Because at the time, if you look at the 1880s, 1890s, the question is, which is controlling which? Is it physics controlling mathematics, or is it mathematics which is leading in the dance between physics? Which is going to control how the mind operates when it's trying to penetrate and map out an understanding of the universe? And a lot of discoveries are happening, right? Discoveries of radiation, Curie's discoveries are all happening. The world of the quantum is of action. The Planck constant is being opened up at that moment, 1900. And there's discoveries on every field. And it's becoming very clear that mathematics is not holding the solutions to these discoveries, because the math only describes what is known up until that moment. But a new discovery requires both understanding your math, but then leaping outside of it. And then later on, you could find a way to find mathematical symbolic expression for your discovery, which has certain constants about it. But it doesn't, it rarely ever happens, because I don't think it ever happens because of the math. And what these guys are basically trying to do, what Hilbert sets out in his 23 problems at this Future of Mathematics, this international mathematics conference that brings together the brightest minds of mathematics around the world, is to, and some of the 23 problems he sets out are legit problems, like the Riemann problem, the nature of prime numbers that are not forecastable. Like even today, we don't know how to forecast the next prime number. There's no formula organizing their unfolding that we can identify. So these are all like legit problems. But then there's some of them early on, like number 2 and number 6, which call for a total systemization and reduction of all mathematics into a new unified language of self-internal consistency that can be represented as logic. And that logic can also be represented mathematically. That would just create sort of a purely formalistic cage that could describe the entire universe, that could be reducible to a limited set of axioms and postulates. So the idea of the infinite of transcendentals would be eliminated from that, and the mind, which is finite in their model, right? The mind is the brain, and the brain is finite because it's the sum of our senses. There's no metaphysics that mean anything that has value in that world. Then if you can reduce everything, you could then just do purely deductive or inductive extrapolations of your basic, of either a phenomenon that you would observe and describe mathematically down to, this is this because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this assumption, this core axiom, and then you could extrapolate it outwards that way too. And in their world, you could have like a mathematical description of the entire universe from beginning to end in time as a limited thing, also in space, because as soon as you put boundary conditions on it in time, you also put boundary conditions in space because it could only, grow at a certain speed or whatever. So you got problems right there, right? Because all of a sudden you have to assume now the existence of a universe outside of which there is no universe, or before which there was not a universe. So that's already a problem, but they don't want to look at that. But so what Bertrand Russell then sets out to do is to achieve this goal of mathematizing the universe in the form of a 3-volume set of the Principia Mathematica in published between 1910 and 1913. In 1913, one of his star pupils is a young mathematics protege from America, Norbert Wiener. Yeah, that's him. Wiener is now brought to Trinity College in Cambridge. He's met by Russell, brought into Russell's like small coterie of talented young boys. These guys like doing that. Whether it's Milner and Milner's kindergarten, or whether it's William Yandell Elliott and the Chatham House of Harvard and his young boys of Kissinger and Brzezinski or whatever. But there's always like these. Anyway. So Norbert Wiener is part of this little group. Ludwig Wittgenstein is another one who's a member of this. Russell himself is a Cambridge apostle, and him and another Cambridge apostle named Alfred North Whitehead, who's Russell's teacher at Cambridge earlier, they together fulfill this project of drafting in, this Principia, which spends something like 80 pages just to like prove mathematically why 2 + 2 is 4 or something. And it's a success. It's considered like the major breakthrough in logic and mathematical logic ever, untouchable. And young Norbert Wiener puts himself on a life's mission to find a practical application for this, to create ways of applying this to human society's governance. Now, one of the core assumptions of Bertrand Russell's worldview that I quote in, I think, my third paper is the view on entropy. He's of the view that entropy is an absolute, the second law of thermodynamics is an absolute fundamental quality of the universe, and ultimately thus that the universe is going to die a heat death. And it's only when we embrace that despair that we can achieve human health, that the human being could become, actually he says it right here. I just pulled it up as a quote. He says that man, this is Bertrand Russell in 1903, that man is the product of causes that have no prevision in the end they were achieving, right? It's just random. That his origin, his growth, his hopes and his fears, his loves and his beliefs are but the outcomes of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve individual life beyond the grave. He's offended by Socrates' proof of the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo. That all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all of the inspiration, all of the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system. That the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. And I just think that quote by Russell, it's just it's sad on the one hand. It's like he's just trying to, it's like somebody just telling you how depressed they are about their belief in the purposelessness of their life. And they're just demanding that you find the same despair that they have.
Mm-hmm.
Just be as weak as I am. Look at me, I'm drowning. Come down into the fucking depths of the water like me. It's like, well, I'm already up here, not drowning, enjoying the oxygen. Why would I go down there with you? It's like, no, you're wrong. You're a delusional fool if you think that oxygen is healthy or your natural state. Here, take this ball and chain, hold on to it, and get into the water, and come down with me. I'll show you. I'll prove it to you.
And not only that, this is the way you should be thinking. This is the way you must think. And I have all of these people around me who believe the same, and you ought to think this way, and we're going to make sure that you think this way.
Oh, well said. Yeah, that's exactly
because science.
Because science. Yeah, because science. No, exactly. It's mockery, and that's how they sort of corral the herd is through largely mockery and elitism. Like, oh, you don't want to be seen sounding like you're denying this obvious truth that all of these smart people believe, and you want to be overheard believing too, right? It's like, yeah, I guess that modern art, that abstract painting, I guess that really is pretty deep. I didn't look at first. I thought it was just somebody shitting on a canvas. No, I guess it is deep. Yeah, waiting to be judged by these smart people you think are around you.
But the funny thing is with that quote is that it's quite beautifully written, right? It's so
it's got a little poetic quality of it,
right?
Yeah.
So there's the poetic quality that he's imbuing this like nihilistic diatribe in, which it's a funny juxtaposition.
Yeah.
That even in the act of defending the meaninglessness of the universe, part of him is striving to put it in a coherent and beautiful form. The very things that he denies exist and
absolutely
have any meaning.
No, a lot of these guys working with Russell, like George Bernard Shaw, who's another anti-human, pro-eugenics Fabian Society leader. He's also, he's got a certain poetic quality, as does H.G. Wells. They're creative. Total perversion of creativity, though, and they're walking self-contradictions, like you said. But then, yeah, like Norbert Wiener. I mean, I just finished reading his books on cybernetics and the human use of human beings, which are this guy he's living his life's mission to fulfilling this, to create a language for the governing class to manage the system. And you got to keep in mind, in the 19th century, again, not only did you have this burst of national sovereignty spreading around the world, where the whole was finally being organized as a community of principle, a harmony of parts working together with no absolute dichotomized class struggles or anything like that. It was an idea of a love of the future, a love of progress that was unifying the behavior of foreign policy around the world. William Gilpin, the former bodyguard of Lincoln and the first governor of Colorado, becomes the champion of the world land bridge of rail through the Bering Strait, where the American-built Trans-Siberian would connect through Alaska into Canada and connect to the transcontinental of the U.S. And he had grids all the way through Africa. This was all accompanying also a burst of inspiration, of optimism that was accompanying discoveries in science of all fields. So it was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of like rich potential, and the unipolar system of empire that could only control in this homogenized Leviathan-like anti-creative way was like disintegrating. So, you had the Fabian Society created in 1886. You had the Round Table movement in Oxford created in 1902 with the Rhodes Trust will of Cecil Rhodes, which created the Round Table movement as an international sort of grouping of think tanks that coordinated the new British Empire policy to recapture the United States. The first version of this was an imperial federation, but then it transmogrified into the League of Nations later on. That's what the Round Table movement created as their next phase. When the first one didn't work, they're like, okay, let's do a one world government that way and get rid of nation states and create a one world military, a one world economy under the Bank of England. That didn't work. And and they're all interfacing with each other, right? So the X Club is sort of the ideological sort of driving seat through Cambridge, and the Royal Society of London is sort of playing into that. That's sort of creating the guiding posts. But then you have these doers think tanks, the Fabian Society, as far as the infiltration of governments, the indoctrination of talented elites, and their redeployment back into whatever target country you want to subvert. They're doing that through the London School of Economics. That's their school that Mackinder is the director of, the founder of geopolitics. And then you have Oxford doing the same thing with a different branch of talented people through the Rhodes Scholarship Program. And again, they're just throughout the 20th century, you could just see these groups interfacing so much. It's like different flavors of the same evil, setting up things like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. That's the Canadian or the American Roundtable movement. So you got that going on. And, Norbert Wiener is now in World War II. He's in charge of developing systems of radar. He's doing a lot of work on feedback loops because they have to figure out, like, when you want to shoot down a plane or a missile, there's a time function where the radar is going to have to, there's time that it takes to get the information back of the position and velocity of the plane. So, and then the person controlling the guns or the missiles, the anti-aircraft missiles, have to then like plug in the data, the positions, and then shoot it down. That's a lot of equations. So he's like looking at the problems of information systems. How does the feedback loops happen? How do you accelerate the density of the time function, right? How do you forecast a linear extrapolation of a thing's velocity and momentum into the future to shoot down where it will be, right? So you got these different ideas that have a usefulness, obviously, in warfare and other things. Knowing what the weather is going to be in a couple of days is useful. That these things are useful. But then he's coming back now, always governed by the Bertrand Russell challenge of formulating now a comprehensive system. This is what Huxley was trying to do with the X Club earlier, and he calls it cybernetics, or it's basically it's based on a Greek word gubernetes, which is where government comes from. And the idea of cybernetics is that you have a helmsman in a boat that is the only person who needs to know what the boat is doing. There's only one person of the thousands of people who might be in this giant boat, each doing their local specialized thing. Only one helmsman needs to have knowledge of celestial astronomy, the knowledge of what all of the parts are doing, but nobody else does. They could just focus on their local thing. And this is like, aha. And the Macy Foundation, which had been also co-sponsoring, like I mentioned, all of this eugenics work, they become the founder of the sponsor of the Macy conferences on cybernetics between 1943 and 1953. Wiener is sort of the trendsetter, the guy who's sort of managing, pulling the stuff together, and he's creating systems of again, information systems theory, the idea of self-learning machines, that machines can do essentially what the human beings can do, but better. That's Norbert Wiener putting this stuff out in the formulation that we currently have today. That's him. And he's only using case studies that don't involve real human creativity. He's using case studies of, like, playing chess and how, you could create a situation where a computer could learn from past chess moves and incorporate that into beating and improving the computer's quality. And it's like, yeah, that's true. That's proven to be true with Go and chess, because these are all games that are defined by a fixed set of rules that you could plug in. That's chess. It teaches you to think in a certain way, like a computer, with that also induces maybe some rage in a lot of people too, because there's more to human mind than that. But he doesn't look at that. He just looks at all of these case studies where we think like that. And so obviously, yes, you can make an argument that computers can replace us and do that job better. But in terms of making discoveries like Max Planck was doing, or like for example, what's his name? The uncertainty principle, Einstein's young friend, what's his name?
Heisenberg?
No, not the uncertainty. Sorry, the unprovability theorem on the
Gödel?
Kurt Gödel, yeah, who develops the in 1932. He's like he's horrified by this line of thought. And Gödel is a real follower of Leibniz, not the Bertrand Russell kind. And Gödel writes this on formally undecidable propositions of the Principia Mathematica in 1932, which pisses off Russell. Alfred Whitehead's class here, and he's like, okay, you got us. but in this beautiful little booklet, I mean, he uses their technique of using mathematical logic to prove that there can be no closed, self-consistent system of descriptive math. There's nothing you could say that could be 100% thoroughly internally consistent based upon its own internal assumptions, because there's always implied something outside of every system. Basically, is how, and he does it in a way that I'm not smart enough to fully internalize this whole thing, but he does it in a really, really clear way. And it demonstrates that the universe ultimately, unlike what Bertrand Russell or Norbert Wiener want to believe, is that there's an openness, an open system quality to everything, including something as specific as math, which is a reflection of a higher reality. So despite that, despite the fact that a machine couldn't do what he did, they continue on with their project. And the Macy conferences throughout this 10-year period, it happens every 6 months. They're bringing together sociologists, people like Eric Trist, Kurt Lewin, like I said, from the Frankfurt School, are frequent participants. Herbert Marcuse is coming through this thing. Adorno, also a lot of Frankfurt School people, a lot of Tavistock people, a lot of physicists, a lot of mathematicians, a lot of scientists, John von Neumann, Oscar Morgenstern, who are game theorists, are also frequent participants, and they're trying to create this new comprehensive logic. The Macy Foundation also is a major sponsor of LSD. So a lot of the spread of LSD is happening directly because of the Macy Foundation's role in doing that work, including getting Ken Kesey into the process, sponsoring Aldous Huxley's work. Aldous Huxley is recruiting different people like, what's his name, the guru of LSD?
Timothy
Leary.
Yeah, him. Yeah, who describes his own discussions with Aldous Huxley in a book he wrote. No, this is an interview he gave in the 70s where he's like, yeah, the CIA is great. He's like, yeah. And he's like openly talking about how the CIA definitely sponsored and brought, LSD around all these campuses. And that's just awesome. And he talks about how Aldous Huxley told him that the real enemy to humanity is monotheistic religion. And the time has come for a new humanistic paganism, which can only be done by this philosophy built around doors of perception. And again, these guys just love it. But the Macy Foundation is so there's a lot of overlap here, right? And so Norbert Wiener is creating a logic of a highly compartmentalized governing structure, which is then adopted by, again, the OECD, a lot of United Nations organizations. It's infesting bureaucracies, this idea of cybernetics. And you've got this overbloating of every government. In Canada, one of the biggest participants and adherents of this is Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who writes, and I got a little quote from him in part 3 in 1969, right as he's doing his major reform of the Canadian government, around the Privy Council office, which is like the node, the central nervous system node. He's like, cybernetics has given us a tool to direct human civilization for the first time ever. We will not let this go. And he does it for the next 4 years. He's organizing and overhauling the entire Canadian government, and creating these giant, like, maximal overbloated bureaucracies. And only, again, him and a small coterie of people like Maurice Lamontagne, who's a co-founder of the Club of Rome, with Alexander King. Alexander King is coming in and out of Canada because it's a maximum controlled zone at that point. And they're actually creating that here, where just a small group of helmsmen control the levers of the system. Every time there's national leaders that arise that tend to resist this thing, like John F. Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy or Enrico Mattei in Italy, or, you got this across the board, they're eliminated. And you've got these either petrified people like Lyndon Johnson or outright just total technocrats like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, who are overseeing the implementation of these sorts of things across the US. And that becomes the basis for today's modern deep state. So when people talk about deep state, they have to have this in their mind. Otherwise, it's just a mystical, weird thing. So, yeah, go on.
It's just, I just wanted to comment. It's very interesting to see how son Justin is carrying on so well in the footsteps of his dad in Canada, the polite Canadians.
Oh yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I'm wondering, Matthew, if you wanted to make a kind of a closing point, and then I think, given the sprawling nature of all this information and all this research, if we might have you on again in the near future, and to continue this, especially where it gets into the kind of contemporary deep state and how all of these organizations are now, as you illustrate in your first article, kind of manifesting all of these ideas.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think one of the things that, again, I couldn't implore people to do any more fervently is to just read the things that scare the oligarchy. I mean, I've been sort of one of my themes that I've been hammering at, and I'm going to make this part 4, part 5 of my series, is what was Leibniz actually doing? What was his method of thinking? Why was he at war with the Newtonians in the Leibniz-Clark correspondences? Why did the Newtonians in the Royal Society that had just taken over England, why did they need to steal the discovery of the calculus from Leibniz and say Newton did it? And they created a whole scandal around that, where obviously Isaac Newton plagiarized these things and many other things, including his inverse square law, from people like real modern Pythagoreans like Leibniz, or like Kepler, or like Huygens, or like Fermat, or Pascal. These were people who were making discoveries. So I think by reading those sorts of writings of Leibniz, which are available, they're not for specialists only. You could be a layman and still get a lot of deep insight into the nature of the human mind, government, economics, everything out of that, as well as the nature of just the universe. People like Norbert Wiener is saying directly that the high priest of cybernetics is Gottfried Leibniz. He says that. And he's sort of doing what Russell is doing. He's like, yeah, we love Leibniz. He basically just he's like the founder of modern information systems theory. It's great. Cybernetics, that's Leibniz. It's like, no, it's not. Leibniz believed in human creativity. And when Leibniz was striving, and what Kurt Gödel died doing, you got to keep this in mind as well. Gödel died by starvation. He died, and this is serious, in 1970, I think 72. And Kurt Gödel died because he discovered, and he wrote about this, that there was an ongoing conspiracy led by Bertrand Russell to destroy Leibniz's writings. Even today, like 90% of Leibniz's writings are not available for public access. You can't get them. And Oscar Morgenstern, he takes Oscar Morgenstern, who doesn't believe him, to a reference library. And he's like, look, there's these references to the existence of these different Leibniz works. Let's go and try to find them. Oh, and Oscar Morgenstern writes in 1952, like, could you believe it? They were all removed. They were all gone. And this is documented in Kurt Gödel's biographer, who writes this and documents this transaction. But Gödel, like I said, he dies. Why does he die? Why does he starve? Because he's convinced that there's a conspiracy to poison and kill him by Bertrand Russell, and he's probably on some degree right. And he won't eat food unless his wife serves it to him, and she gets sick for a couple of weeks, can't feed him, and he dies. So you've got this thing which is very much afraid of a quality of creative genius that was exemplified by people like Max Planck. I know, Harrison, you read Planck's Philosophy of Physics, pure Leibniz right there. Einstein as well was a major fan and a practitioner of this, and it produces a living refutation of their system, because the only way you can refute that human beings are not replaceable by machines is to tap into your non-machine like qualities of thought. If you don't do it, you can't fundamentally, and that's the problem why most people think that Elon Musk is really brilliant right now. They think he's like a real brilliant genius. This guy he's a synthetic personality. He's obviously like a cardboard cutout who like really believes crazy shit that obviously human beings will be replaced by AI unless we merge with machines, or that like windmills and solar panels will obviously take over the energy needs of all of society, obviously at the singularity. It's like, no, scientifically, that's not true. Anybody who is half a brain and looks at basic facts knows that that's not true, but you believe it. So you're a synthetic personality. You're like many of these cardboard cutouts peppering our landscape historically, like Newton or Darwin, who never discovered anything. But there's political motives behind it. But people believe it because they have not tapped into those inner qualities of heart, mind that they have access to, or they should, if they were given those opportunities in a non-oligarchical system of education and culture. So we have to sort of take it onto ourselves to read the writings of those original sources, like Plato. Immerse yourself over a month of reading through Plato's dialogues. See what happens in your mind. Take notes. Read Leibniz's discourses on metaphysics, or his. Don't go to the monadology. That's the last thing he wrote. It's like the condensement of a lot of deep ideas. You got to go through some other stuff first. But read the writings of Planck, of Einstein, and on their views on philosophy and method. And you will find those things being much more in coherence with your own powers of reason. It'll be much more natural to do than you would even imagine. It's not based on like memorizing shit you're being told to memorize to pass a test in high school, which is why I failed all my math tests in high school. Because, I wanted to know, why is this symbol true? Why is this formula true? I couldn't get an answer. So I'm like, I can't hold that in my mind. But try to actually look at what Leibniz does. He's actually taking you through, like, why is the infinitesimal calculus right? He's actually taking you through here's the physical experiment I did. I use this hanging chain. It has these forces of gravity that are infinitely changing at every infinitesimal moment. And I can now develop questions, paradoxes that I can test out to see what is the unifying, characteristic of a hanging chain. And since all hanging chains can be made different, is there a unifying process that can describe them all at a differential as well as an integral, at every differential moment, as well as the integral as a whole, the one and the many? So it's doable. It's accessible. It's more accessible than people might realize. And I would say, if they want, on the Rising Tide Foundation website, every week we host weekly lectures with experts on various fields. That's every Sunday. People can just write an email to info@risingtidefoundation.net and get an invite to our live Sunday afternoon lectures. We also do readings. We have study groups that meet up during the weeknights and read over Zoom and work through these things. Right now, we're about to start working on Leibniz's discourses on metaphysics, starting this Wednesday. So if people want to, again, be a part of those things and read along and do the work, they can do that. Again, just send the email out. And on the Rising Tide Foundation website, if they go to the very bottom of that, risingtidefoundation.net, my wife and I, Cynthia, who runs this with me, we set up a Library of Alexandria, a digital Library of Alexandria, where there's like an index of some of the greatest minds that we know about. And we just put them in alphabetical order and found original writings that you could just click on Leibniz or Vernadsky or Einstein and just get their original writings online. And, I don't know how long that they will be made available online. Things are, shaky right now, but they're there. So the resources are there. That's all I'm saying.
Excellent. And I don't think this conversation would be complete unless or someone made at least a brief mention of Resurrection Ertugrul. We're finally into about 40% into season 5, Matthew, where Ertugrul is talking to his sons and says, the foundation of the state, the strength of the state, is the family. And it was a very basic, simple, but powerful talk he gives his sons. One of them being Osman, the future of the Turkish state. So we did manage to throw in Resurrection Ertugrul in there, but really a fascinating discussion of all of these ideas and interests and organizations. And I do hope you include that story about Gödel and Russell and Leibniz's, the Stalinization of Leibniz's of works. That sounds like just an incredible story in and of itself. And what can I say? It's such a pleasure to listen to you and to talk to you and go over these truths. And we look forward to speaking with you again and reading these articles. And once again, risingtidefoundation.net and canadianpatriot.org is where you can find a lot of these articles. Also, Strategic Culture Foundation and sot.net is where we're going to be publishing some of these things as well. So, as always, a real pleasure, Matthew. Thank you.
And thank you guys for, again, setting up this oasis of ideas on the internet. I really appreciate the work that you guys go through as well. And it's always a pleasure to be on. And anytime you want to have this chat again, and we can continue this into so many directions, let me know.
All right, will do. Thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
All right, take care.